So welcome to the second webinar in the Sustainable Winter Road Maintenance Operations webinar series. It's sponsored by CESTiCC and Center for Advanced Multimodal Mobility Solutions in Education. This presentation today is from Dr. Veneziano from Iowa State University. Give it another minute or so, but for those who are here already, there is the possibility of getting professional development hour certificates if you contact CESTiCC after the presentation. It will also, a recording of this presentation will also be available online at the CESTiCC website if you have colleagues who couldn't make it today but are interested in this topic. So, David, are you ready to go?
Sure, I'm ready whenever you are.
All right, well then I'd say I'm going to hand it over to you and feel free to begin.
Thank you, Vicki, and thank you everyone. Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you're at. Thanks for joining us for the webinar today. As mentioned, my name is David Veneziano. I am associated with the Institute for Transportation at Iowa State University, or INTRANS is what we go by, and so if I say that, I'm just taking the abbreviation there. Previous to that, I've been here for the past 4 years. Previous to that, though, I was at Montana State University as a researcher, with a lot of the work that I was doing there associated with some of the societal and financial aspects of winter maintenance operations. I still do a little bit of winter maintenance work here. Part of my job, aside from research, is also doing training for our local agencies. I'm part of the local technical assistance program that's housed within INTRANS. And so that work allows me to get out in the field and meet with our counties and our cities and hear a lot of the problems that they face, not only from the winter maintenance perspective, but in general maintenance throughout the year as well. Right now, of course, in state, we're facing flooding. This past winter, though, we had a rough winter, and so that was one of the challenges that our local agencies here and throughout the country certainly were facing. Just a little bit of background on myself. Today, we're going to be covering user expectations and the social dimensions of winter maintenance, kind of a topic that I think we tend to overlook. We know we're serving the public, and we certainly are doing our best to meet the traveling needs of the public, but also the slides I'm going to go through in the next few minutes or so basically get into what does society expect from us, and how are those expectations potentially changing as time goes by. And so this is just a brief overview of what I'll be covering. We'll touch upon some of the societal expectations associated with winter maintenance. We'll get into a little bit on the information that travelers have available to them and that they take into consideration when they're traveling during the winter, both during a storm as well as after, when we're out there trying to get our maintenance work done and get things back to normal. We'll touch on agency performance measures a little bit, and then wrap up with future considerations, because nothing is static, and certainly technology is changing and the world is evolving, and there's going to be impacts on the transportation system, and certainly unique impacts potentially on the winter maintenance operations that we're performing. And then we'll just conclude with a brief summary of what we've gone over today. So first off, bear with me. I'm gonna go through a story associated with the expectations of the public when it comes to winter maintenance operations. Here in Iowa and throughout the Midwest, this past February 23rd and 24th, we had a storm roll through that was particularly severe. Basically, we'd have warnings days in advance. The weather forecast basically said we're gonna get snow, it's gonna turn into blizzard conditions. As luck would have it, of course, my daughter's gymnastic meet fell over that weekend. And so we live in a town called Boone, and we'll see a map in a second here. That's about 40 miles north of Des Moines where this meet was going to be going on. The debate began in our house of whether or not we should travel down to Des Moines or not the night before and spend the night at a hotel. The decision ultimately was made. My wife made the decision, no, we'll be fine. They're probably just overblowing the forecast, and we don't necessarily need to go to that length. I was fine with that because I had my out as a good husband. I'd done everything I could at that point. Basically, what the forecast was calling for was rain in the afternoon on Saturday the 23rd, changing over very briefly, basically, to freezing rain for maybe an hour or two, and then that went into snow. The kicker, though, was it wasn't going to be a lot of snow. It was about 4 or 5 inches forecast, but it would change over and there'd be winds throughout the night. So the storm began, like I mentioned, with rain in the mid-afternoon on the 23rd. That was where I made my last check and said, "You sure you don't want to go?" "Nope." "Okay, we're good." Flash over. What we had was basically not a lot of freezing rain. It was basically a flash freeze. We went from rain to basically a sheet of ice on the roadways, pretty much within a half hour or so. I remember looking out during the storm, look out the window, and it was raining at one point, got up about a half hour later, looked out, and I said to my wife, "Hey, it's snowing." It was that quick, literally. So we had a little bit of a layer of ice on the pavement, and then the snow, as I said, ended up being about 4 or 5 inches, depending on where you were at. The kicker, though, was that this was 35 to 45 mile an hour winds throughout the night. And so what happened was basically we ended up with blizzard conditions. We decided in the house to get up early the next morning and go to Des Moines, leave ourselves a few hours of travel time just to be safe. I'm getting ready that next morning, and my wife walks in and hands me the phone and says, "Look what 511 shows on its map." That little oval, hopefully my pointer, my arrow is showing up here, this oval is basically the route we were going to take. We live up here where the top of the oval, down at the bottom is approximately where we had to get to. If you look at the map, you're looking at a map that's saying travel not advised and impassable. So the DOT was giving us good information. It was accurate. I believed it, but then again, I have the bias of having worked in this profession and knowing enough about winter maintenance and operations to know that they're telling the truth. But my wife didn't necessarily believe it. So I said, okay, we'll make an attempt to go. We'll figure out a way. Tried to go north of town, bucked a couple of snow drifts on the roadway, got to an intersection I'm familiar with, stopped the vehicle because we were doing about 28 miles an hour at most, and said to my wife, "I don't know where the road is past this intersection." I drive that road every week. I know county maintenance forces had been out on it within the past couple hours. It was that bad. My wife says, "Well, let's try south of town." Okay, fine, we'll try going south and heading east to the interstate from there. Tried the same thing, a little bit better. We had a railroad embankment that kind of cut down on the wind, so we could actually, the sun was out once you got out of the blowing drifts. Started heading east, started to go south on the intended roadway, which is, again, listed as travel not advised on the map. Made it about 3 miles there and encountered a stop line of cars. Stop line of cars basically was because of, this isn't a photo of the plow, but basically it was the same situation. The plow had gotten stuck ahead of us. I'm sitting there looking out the window, and we're getting rocked around because the winds are blowing us around, and I'm watching a car parked kind of to the side of me that's basically visibly drifting over. You could see the snowdrift building on this thing. That was the point, and we'd been doing this for about 45 minutes now and made it 3 miles out of town from our house. I said to my wife, "We're not making it." She said, "Yeah, I guess you're right." My daughter, of course, wasn't too happy with that decision either, but we turned around, trekked back. Come to find out, that particular storm in our county alone, this is just one 30-mile by 30-mile county area, 100 people had to be pulled out or rescued by first responders out of their cars because they'd been in the ditch. That is very atypical, but that was the common theme throughout central Iowa that day. My point to this whole story is that when we started the weekend, when we started that Saturday and even that Sunday morning, in my household and many others in the area, there were differing views of what our expectations were for the roadway conditions to be. My expectation was, hey, the DOT is telling me it's impassable, it's impassable. My wife and daughter's expectations, it's a roadway. They've got snow plows, they'll plow, and we'll be able to get there. It might take us a couple hours to do, but we'll get there. So just within one household, you had these different expectations. Certainly that was true of other residents in the area too. Otherwise, we wouldn't have 100 people getting pulled out of vehicles. So that's what we're faced with as winter maintenance professionals. It's kind of in line with what the overall society expects nowadays. You know, we've got Amazon. We can order something, it's there tomorrow. If it's snowing, hey, get the plow out there and we'll be able to drive wherever we want with it during the storm, or at least, you know, within an hour after the end of the storm. And so we're faced with high expectations in a lot of instances, which may not be realistic, certainly wouldn't be safe in some of these conditions. We had counties that were pulling their maintenance crews during this storm, just saying, you know, look, it's not safe for them to be out there. And they were getting that message out on their Twitter feeds and everything else saying, hey, if we pulled our people off the roads, you shouldn't be on the roads either, to the general public. But there's still that perception that we've got maintenance crews, get them out there, get it done, and let us get wherever we want to go whenever we want to. And so that's kind of the battle we're faced with here, is just tempering society's expectations with what the reality of a storm is kind of presenting us with as we're going along doing our maintenance. So what does society expect from us when we're thinking about winter maintenance? Well, certainly mobility is a big one. People want to be able to travel on the roads. They want to be able to do so safely. There are a lot of people in that particular storm who didn't want to end up in the ditch. They ended up in the ditch or in a snowbank or wherever they ended up. But certainly they were expecting to be able to get wherever they were going safely and stay on the roadway. There are environmental expectations on the part of the public. These tend to be a little bit higher in more environmentally sensitive areas as opposed to other regions of the country where, you know, let's say the flatlands, where people may not necessarily be concerned with the environmental impacts of our maintenance materials getting into waterways and things like that. And certainly there are costs. Society expects to get the most out of their tax dollars, but at the same time, they also don't want to pay out of pocket related to what we're doing winter maintenance wise. And so we'll get into some of those out of pocket costs a little bit later on as we progress through these slides. Of course, we all know and we all agree there are benefits to what we're doing out there when we're doing winter maintenance. Crash reduction is a big one. We keep people safe. We make sure that they don't go off the roadway. Certainly we aim to at least provide a roadway surface that's safe for them to travel on, hopefully not leading to serious injury type of crashes. Improve mobility, certainly we keep people moving as well. And by keeping people moving and not having them trudge along snow-covered roadways at lower speeds, we're certainly able to help reduce travel costs as well through fuel efficiency for our drivers. So getting into each of the expectations individually, from a mobility standpoint, of course, people expect to be able to drive the speed they want to drive with, and this is true even in a non-winter maintenance scenario. People want to drive at the speed they're most comfortable with, as well as, for the most part, most people, as fast as they are capable of going. And so the expectation when we have a winter storm, when people have talked to the general public and found this information out, people expect to be able to drive at the posted speed limit very shortly after a storm has occurred. Maybe not necessarily 1 hour after that storm has ended, but they certainly want to see a couple hours, 2-3 hours down the road. They want to have bare pavement so they can go as fast as they would normally do on a dry, clear day. It's as simple as that. And so that's one of the measures that we look at, or that we hear back from the public when it comes to mobility. Somewhat tied to that is just the idea of time to bare pavement. The public has an expectation that after a storm, even if traffic has been out there, let's say it's a light snow, but it's a snow that's getting packed down by tire tracks, there's an expectation that, hey, I'm going to, 1 hour, 2 hours after the storm, our maintenance crews are going to have this down to bare pavement in the area. And so I trust that our winter maintenance, our public works staff is going to get this road clear. And why isn't it clear 5 hours later? Why can't I see the pavement markings of the pavement? And so that's kind of one of those mobility expectations that the public is, they're more, they're looking for that more and more frequently now, unfortunately. Unfortunately for us, in that it just puts that much more of a burden on us to get things done that much faster. We may or may not have the staff and equipment to get it done as quickly as everyone would like. Winter Severity Index, a lot of states are starting to put this type of tool together, this type of measure together, as a way to communicate to the public that, hey, you know what, not all storms are alike. Some storms are more severe than others, and it's going to take us longer to get that maintenance work done. So you're going to have to kind of bear with us, understand that, when we get a foot of snow, we're not going to be able to get bare pavement out on all of our primary roadways within 2 hours. It's going to take some time. If there's drifting going on, we're going to have to address that. And so we do have these things that are available to us to communicate with the public. In a lot of ways, a lot of our agencies do a very good job of communicating information during the storm, shortly thereafter, after its end, to the public. But of course, we also have a long way to go to getting the public to understand and grasp the situation that we're faced with as winter maintenance professionals, that sometimes it's going to take a little bit longer to get our job done. From a safety perspective, the public intuitively, and I say that, I've sat down with, as part of research projects, basically focus groups of people sitting around, general public sitting around in a room, talking about when they feel comfortable on a winter roadway versus when they start to see that comfort level deteriorate and they're a little apprehensive about traveling. And so when we've talked to people in those types of settings, generally people become less comfortable going out, as you'd expect, less comfortable driving on roadways as conditions start to deteriorate. So we'll go through some examples a little bit later on, the level of service, and we'll see some images associated with this. But when you start to see snowpack on the roadway and the public loses sight of where their wheel paths are, or where the lanes are, that's where you start to see that lack of comfort come in, and people are a little more reluctant to drive unless they really need to get somewhere for work or whatever the case may be. When we talk to people, yes, some can tolerate bare wheel paths. I fall into that category. If I can see a wheel path, I'm going to be driving slower, but at least I know where my lane is. When we lose that wheel path, that's where things really start to, that's kind of the line that a lot of people draw for their comfort. If you can't see where at least some small portion of the roadway is to help guide you, that's when a lot of people in the general public feel like, yeah, it's not safe for me to be out there. And of course, when we talk to the public about things like snow cover, snow-packed roadways, icy roads, black ice, they're always quick to add that, we know the maintenance forces are out there, but really you got to use more treatment, and you got to put more material down to get rid of that condition faster than you necessarily would be. And so the public recognizes that maintenance forces are getting their job done. Sometimes, though, they'd like to see everything in the kitchen sink thrown at a roadway to get it open, typically for their own personal reason, but certainly there's also a lot of people recognize that, yeah, our main roadways are interstates and our arterial roadways. There is a benefit to keeping those clear and getting those opened up as soon as possible after a storm event. Environmental, I touched on this a little bit. In some regions, in the environmental impacts of our winter maintenance operations, and more specifically than anything else, the materials we're using, they are a concern. The one that comes to mind, and this is associated with some work I did a few years ago, northern Idaho, mountainous areas, very pristine, nice wilderness area. People that were, panels that were surveyed up there, We're a lot more concerned with some of the chlorides we were using on roadways and their impact on the waterways and wildlife and things like that, as opposed to when we talk to groups in the southern part of the state, the Boise area, for example, where it's not necessarily that wild, rugged wilderness type of situation where they were less concerned. And so there, environmental concerns certainly are on a lot of people's minds, just in general. But certainly, bear in mind that from a public expectations perspective, yes, there are regions of the country where some of the materials we're using, if you ask the public about it, they will say that yes, it's a concern. A couple of projects or a couple of works that have been done in the past. Colorado, this is about a 15-year-old study now, but talking with the public in that state, chlorides, the public recognized that chlorides provided a clearer road, but that they also had a corrosive effect. And so 34% of the people that were surveyed as part of that work were okay with it. The remainder, of course, were not necessarily in favor of using those chlorides because of the corrosive impacts. More interestingly, though, from that work is that when asked, the public said that materials that would be less effective on keeping the roadway clear but also had less corrosion, fewer people were in favor of those. So the public was still in favor of using chlorides. The problem with the chlorides, of course, the corrosion aspect, a lot of people in the general public leech on or grasp on to, it's going to corrode my vehicle, I've got to go take it to the car wash, I've got to get it cleaned more often, things like that. And so that's the other side of the environmental coin, is the personal impact to them and to their personal property in the form of their vehicle. Idaho, this is some work that I had participated on with researchers at the University of Idaho as well. But what we did was sit down and, again, sit with focus groups, talk with them, find out what their concerns were with winter maintenance operations, also find out what type of roadway conditions they were comfortable driving on versus not. And so when we said, okay, how comfortable are you with the impacts of sand and plowing? Just using sand, no salt mix or anything in that. And everyone pretty much had no concern. The only issue that was raised there is potential chipping of the windshield or abrasiveness on the paint of the vehicle. But really, from an environmental perspective, there wasn't a concern there. When we brought up chlorides, a lot of people were unsure of whether or not they'd be concerned with it. We heard that, yeah, I have some concerns, especially in the northern part of the state. Yeah, I have concerns with the environmental impacts of getting into waterways. Some people recognized also that, again, the impact to their vehicle on corrosion. But one thing that this illustrated to us, especially when looking back at what Colorado had found, is the public doesn't necessarily know what we're using out on the roadways or what its impacts are. And for good or for bad, you can weigh in on either side there. That influences their overall view of winter maintenance when they do get asked about it. And so if they have a background on knowing the impacts of salt or different chlorides and their corrosive capabilities, they'll voice it. If they don't have that background, if they just kind of get presented general information, they tend to be on board with what we're doing. And so I don't know if that calls for us to be more transparent on what we're using. Maybe it does if we're in an environmentally sensitive area. But take that for what it is, that the public kind of has mixed views on what we use and also mixed levels of understanding of what we're doing out there in terms of the materials we're putting down on the roadways. So overall, there really hasn't been a lot of differentiation of impacts, and I have yet in parentheses for the materials that we use. Because again, depending on what region you're in and different environmental groups or things like that, there may or may not be some publicity that's developed related to what you're using on your winter roadways and how that could impact the environment. So just something to keep in mind there. Of course, costs are also a concern. I touched on this a little bit earlier, but certainly the public's concern with costs it's twofold. One is that they're getting some direct costs incurred on them. So vehicle corrosion, vehicle damage, sand and grit, wearing of their paint or chipping a windshield, whatever the case may be there. As well as the cost, a lot of agencies do promote, hey, you know, after a winter storm, we've been putting materials down on the roadway, go get your car washed. And of course, there's that direct cost that, hey, I have to go out and pay for my car wash to be done. And so while that may only be, you know, $7 or $8, added up over a few winter storms, if you're doing that and you're really concerned with your vehicle and corrosion, it starts to put a dent in the pocketbook. And so that's one of the public's concerns related to what we're doing. And of course, also there's the taxpayer side of the coin and making sure that an agency is using its resources effectively. There's no waste of materials or overuse of labor or anything like that. Of course, on the agency side of the coin, certainly always tighter budgets. Everybody's stretching their dollars as far as they can, obviously. But there's the flip side of that, that as resources dwindle financially, if there isn't the same funding stream coming in, there's that potential for lower levels of service. And so it may take longer to get the roadways cleared. How do we convey that to the public and let them know that, hey, we have a smaller budget this year. We aren't necessarily going to be throwing everything but the kitchen sink at this storm. We're going to have to prioritize roadways, things like that, when we're doing clearing and maintenance operations. So there's that aspect that we need to be keeping in mind from a societal expectation. And certainly also the increased accountability that we see more and more of now. We need to be doing a better job. And for the most part, agencies are doing a good job of this, but you know, tracking those maintenance costs, watching what our labor inputs are, keeping track of our depreciation on some of the vehicles and the equipment that we're using, and our material use. Are we using it efficiently? What are those costs, and what have those been for this past winter, so that we can report that sort of information out to the public and get the message across that yes, we are being careful stewards with our tax dollars, and at the same time trying to provide you with the greatest level of service that we can during our winter storm events. So with that overview of what society expects out of our winter maintenance operations, I think, you know, there also has to be a consideration of what are travelers expecting when a storm goes on? How are they thinking through things? What information are they looking at or using or getting to help them make their decisions as a storm event goes on? And so certainly we as public agencies have a number of tools available to us to help us reach the public both before they make their trip, as well as if they are making a trip during a storm, immediately after a storm. We can give them information they need to stay safe and travel on roadways where it's appropriate for them to do so, versus taking roadways where it may not necessarily be safest for them to do that travel. So we have intelligent transportation systems, of course, ITS, as well as technology-based traveler information that's certainly seen growth in the last decade or decade and a half. On the ITS side of the coin, we certainly have seen a number of different systems developed over time. The most common, of course, that we're using to communicate directly with the public is variable message signs, letting them know in advance that a storm is forecast for this weekend, for example, letting them know during the storm that whatever a certain roadway may be closed or impassable during the event, and that they should seek an alternative route. Certainly well in advance of that closure, but also as they get closer in, letting them know that something's going on that they need to be aware of. And then site-specific systems as well, things like changeable message signs that only become active when there's an ice presence detected on the roadway at recurring locations. So you've got a shaded curve up in the mountains where there's always ice forming. in certain conditions, it makes sense to have a system out there that turns on and warns drivers to slow down as they approach that location when that condition is present. So that bottom picture there, that actually happened here in Ames, Iowa. That's where Iowa State University is. This is the day after the Super Bowl in 2018, so we had a lot of traffic coming down from Minneapolis after that event, passing through town. We had a snowstorm blow through at the same time. Right past the camera, this is being taken from a bridge, and just before that bridge was a sign basically saying whiteout conditions ahead, slow down, and the video associated with this still showed people coming through in those whiteout conditions, just flying along, and the end result was about a 90-car pileup. So even when we do our best to let people know within the storm, sometimes the general public just doesn't pay attention to what we're trying to convey to them. On the technology side of the coin, we certainly have seen explosive growth in the last decade and a half of smartphone and now tablet ownership that really gives us as agencies and winter maintenance professionals a tool to get the message through to people while they're en route. Now, granted, people have to seek, the drivers, the traveling public, and they have to seek that information out. It's not something we can just push to them and have it appear on their phone necessarily, but traveler information websites, apps, map apps, and things like 511 websites, certainly those are very useful tools. They can show the public what's going on at a location, CCTV images that the public can click on and see what that site condition at that particular point in the roadway is. All those things basically available at someone's fingertips. We have infrastructure in the field that kind of feeds into those apps and websites. Our cameras, our RWIS data, travel speeds, open up any Google Maps or any of those types of apps now, and you're getting that travel speed displayed on the roadway. And so that's a very useful feature that will help let the traveling public know, hey, it's slower travel up ahead. I need to be paying more attention, slow down. Facebook and Twitter, great for getting the message out of what's happening during a storm. Particularly useful, I think, to the people that are at home, maybe on the fence, deciding whether or not they should go out and travel. Does a nice job of letting people know, hey, we've got X number of roadways blocked or impassable right now. Consider not traveling unless absolutely essential. Very useful tools, again, to get that information across to the public in another way that's right at their fingertips. Of course, there are drawbacks to these technologies, and of course, hopefully everyone listening, being transportation professionals, recognize this offhand. But distracted driving, they certainly, if you're the only driver, you're only the driver in the vehicle, and you don't have a passenger with you, you're sitting there looking at your phone, trying to see what travel conditions are throughout the state or up ahead on your roadway. You're going to be distracted. And certainly one of the last places we want people to be distracted is during a winter weather event, when they're out on the roadways where there's slick pavement, where there are maintenance vehicles out there. We don't want people to not be paying attention to the roadway and ending up hitting a vehicle, going off the roadway into the ditch, wherever the case may be. So that is the drawback, is the distracted driving potential for the technology-based tools we have available right now is still pretty significant. Of course, the other side of that also is the amount of information, or what information we're providing, really does vary by route. We do a great job nationwide of providing information on our interstates, for example. And so there's a wealth of information. If I'm driving in a winter weather event and I'm on I-80 here in Iowa, I know that I'm going to have a lot of information available to help me guide my decision making. If I'm out on a county gravel road, I'm not going to have that information available. I'm certainly not going to have travel speeds. There aren't going to be vehicles equipped with Waze driving all over those county roads in a storm. I'm not going to have a CCTV camera every 5 miles showing me what weather conditions look like on a gravel road. And so really, While the public may expect all that information to be available blanket across our whole roadway system, that isn't necessarily going to be the case. And so I don't know if that means we have to do a better job of educating the public on what information is going to be available and that it varies by route, or whether that's something that's kind of organically occurring and the public's grasping this as time goes by. But certainly we want, it needs to be recognized that we can't provide information for every route all the time in real time. So I mentioned a couple times already the concept of level of service, which I'm guessing most people on the call today are already familiar with, but we'll go into these in a little bit more detail. When we're considering the expectations of the general public on measuring maintenance performance, we do have a couple of different ways we can do that. Level of service is one, and we'll get into that in detail in the next few slides. But also setting maintenance goals and articulating those to the public. What are we seeking to do during a storm and after a storm to maintain our roadways? That's another way of helping to ensure that we're meeting performance expectations on the public's part, as well as getting that information out and across to them. Of course, always our objectives are going to be safety and mobility. They go hand in hand. That's what we're always trying to provide the public. We want to make sure that our roadways are safe for them to drive on after these events, to give them the mobility they need to get to go where they need to go. So level of service, we all, for the most part, I'm guessing, know that it's some sort of targeted benchmark that we're trying to achieve given our labor, equipment, and material inputs. And so what we have available to us to get the job done, the level of service metric basically is what we're trying to meet to provide that, to meet that goal. Most of us know in the numeric or alphabetic scale of level of service, and so it can be an A through E, or A through D, or E, F, whatever the case may be there, or a 1 through 5 ranking. That's the most commonly used. There are also cases where we do have political or customer expectations that are just stated as our level of service goal. And so, for instance, the easiest way to say this would be all arterials within the city will be cleared within X hours of the end of a storm. We can also just state the simple goal to the public that we're going to maintain our roads as safe and passable as possible within the storm, as well as immediately after the storm, recognizing then that we'll do cleanup operations and we'll get down to bare pavement as time goes by, but that our focus is going to be on making roads safe and passable. We can do things like observed speeds. We get, there's more and more vehicles equipped now to report back, Waze data, for example, that reports back the speed of a vehicle. We can look at that from a maintenance perspective and say, hey, this roadway has a lower speed right now. We need to target our maintenance forces over there and get the speeds back up on that particular roadway to closer to what the posted speed limit is, versus this other roadway where we've been doing maintenance for the last 3 hours and it's green, good traffic flow, and traffic's flowing at normal speeds. So let's take a look at some levels of service. These again are examples that we used when we sat down with the public in Idaho in focus groups. Basically with the idea of showing them these, we didn't say, hey, this is level of service A, B, C, or D. What we did was just show them the picture and say, how do you feel about this roadway? How would you feel about traveling? So generally, this would be a level of service A roadway. You can see bare pavement, you can see pavement markings, it's wet, but it's good. People, when we showed them this picture, they were okay with it. They said, yeah, I'd feel very comfortable driving on this. This would be my ideal roadway, and recognizing that, it's not always possible to have this type of condition. It's going to vary by storm and snowfall quantities and things like that. But yeah, I feel good about this roadway. This is what I'd like to see. A level of service B roadway, when we show this to the public, this is where people start to kind of draw the lines. They say, okay, I can see wheel paths. That's okay. Yeah, the center line or some of the lane lines are covered, but I can see those wheel paths. That gives me a path to follow. I know where the roadway is. I know where the surface is. I'm still okay with this type of roadway to drive on. If it had a little bit more snow cover, maybe I'd be a little leery about driving on this surface, but right now it's okay. So this kind of gives us from a maintenance perspective, a idea of what the public's going to expect for us during a storm, as well as after a storm has ended, in terms of what an acceptable driving surface for them to kind of go about their daily lives and get back to normal might be. Recognizing that we can't always, again, get down to bare pavement on every roadway immediately after a storm. Level C is this is about the tipping point now for most drivers. When we show pictures like this, drivers would say, okay, I can't really see the lane lines. I don't know where the center of the roadway is. There's a little bit of bare pavement, so I know it's still drivable. There's snowpack though, and so I may go out if I need to in this type of case, but I also may stay home. And so, from a maintenance perspective, this is the kind of roadway that we may need to focus a little more effort on. Once we've gotten the system passable, the roadway network passable, then maybe we have to circle back and again start up on maintenance and do some more plowing, put down some materials here, so we can get to that at least bare wheel path type of condition as time goes by. The real tipping point, or the point where most of the people we talk to in a focus group would draw the line and say, I'm not going out on this, is black ice. This photo, it is black ice. It's probably a little bit slushy. It looks a little slushy, but it is an ice surface. When we talk to the public, their whole feedback on this kind of surface is, yeah, I can see pavement because I can see the dark color coming through the ice, but I know it's slick. I know that I shouldn't be out on it. I know that I need to let maintenance get out there and put materials down, run a plow over it, whatever the case may be. I know that it has to be taken care of and addressed before it's safe for me to travel out there. In additional level of service, we have maintenance goals that we can set. Again, these are just basically stated metrics, whether it's time-based or similar measures that say, when a storm occurs, we're going to get this done within X amount of time. So, for example, time-based metric or maintenance goal would be, we're going to, as an agency, produce bare pavement within 5 hours at the end of the storm on the whole roadway network. Simple as that. We can look at also just setting the goal of, we're going to clear all of our arterial roadways first, then we'll circle back and do the collectors, then we'll work on residential streets. That would be a traffic or a corridor route classification type based metric. We can also look at friction levels. Some states have a large number of friction sensing devices out, both stationary at ARWA stations as well as on vehicles, on maintenance vehicles. And so we can try to maintain to a safe friction level. And so knowing at points along the roadway, as well as through our mobile operations, what the friction level is along a particular route, we can redirect maintenance forces to roadways where friction might be a little bit lower and may need to have a little more maintenance done in order to get that job done. So in addition to current public expectations, we really need to look at the future. And the future, as we all know or hear about in the news frequently, is connected and autonomous vehicles. We look at them, and it seems like everywhere you turn, the article or the story is, oh, they'll be along in the next 5 years. And it always seems that 5 years is moving on down the road at this point. But eventually these are going to come out on a widespread basis and be the prevalent vehicles out on our system. And so when that happens, public expectations are likely to change with it. And why is that? Look at what autonomous vehicles promise. Mobility anywhere, anytime. You know, it's a technology that'll come along and allow the elderly to get wherever they need to go without any, it kind of gives them the freedom to travel. It can get young kids to daycare without their parents having to drop them off. Things like that are what we hear. And what that means is to the public, travel anywhere, anytime literally means anywhere, anytime. If there's a blizzard out there, hey, my autonomous vehicle knows the way. I'm going to be fine. It's going to know where the roadway is. I'm not going to end up in a ditch as it might be now where I'm driving it. And really, that's kind of a misconception, I think, partly because no one's really looked at, to my knowledge, and I still haven't come across this. If anyone on this call has heard differently, I'd love to hear it, because I'd love to look at the research on this. But no one's looked at what happens to autonomous vehicles, how they're going to operate, what their needs are to operate safely in the winter. You hear a lot about autonomous vehicles using machine vision, and they're going to look at signs and pavement markings. What happens when there's whiteout conditions and you can't see signs or pavement markings? Sure, we might have an accurate GPS map also involved, but that may not necessarily be enough. So what's the impact of, what do we need to be thinking about maintaining our roadways in the winter to provide a surface that's safe for autonomous vehicles? The other side of that is especially those out in the mountain states hear this every winter, I think. Don't use your cruise control on snow and ice. How is an autonomous vehicle different than cruise control? To me, it really isn't. But again, how those are going to perform on a winter winter surface, and what maintenance is going to be needed, really, it's still out there. But certainly what it comes down to is the public may expect even faster winter maintenance out of us as professionals going forward in the future as these technologies take hold. So just something to keep in mind there. So to summarize, often public expectations are high. People expect mobility anytime, anywhere, and it's only going to get more prevalent, that expectation, as we get in-vehicle technologies, connected and autonomous vehicles coming along. The expectation is certainly for safety and mobility, and typically that's very shortly after the end of a storm. Most people will recognize during the storm it may not necessarily be safe for them to be out there, but certainly after the storm's ended, they want to be out and getting where they want to go. So providing information and both before a storm, during the storm, and even after the storm does help temper expectations on the part of the public. Sometimes I think the pre-storm information we provide may fall on deaf ears, but during storm and post-storm, a lot of the public does grasp it and seem to recognize it may not be the time for them to go out and travel yet. There are different methods and approaches we've covered to meeting traveler expectations. Certainly setting goals through level of service or performance measures help agencies in producing meeting the needs of the traveling public and producing expected results for the traveling public. Of course, expectations are likely to change over time, and as I touched on a little bit briefly on the previous slide, connected and autonomous vehicles are really what's going to be driving that in the future. This is my contact information. I'll kind of turn things back over to Vicki, and if anyone has any questions, I'm certainly happy to take them at this time.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and unmute everybody, and you now all have control of your own volume and can ask questions of David. Anyone have any questions? All right, well, if no one has any questions, then I'd like to thank, Jiangming, do you have something to say?
No, I don't have a question since I'm quite familiar with David's work. I just want to say it's a nice presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jiangming.
All right, well, if no one has any questions, thank you all for coming, and I'll remind you that the next presentation in this series will be occurring on June 6th, and it's called The Fundamentals of Plowing, Anti-Icing, De-Icing, and Sanding by Dr. Alex Klein-Paste. And I hope you join us then. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.